I would like to confirm, Stanford, are you online or not?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly. Thank you very much. Just to introduce you, yes, Stanford is responsible for commercial building disclosure program. Am I introducing right?
Yes, that's right. You got the right person.
Okay, thank you very much. So the floor is yours, Stanford, please.
Great, thank you very much, and also thanks to Felicity and my team who's helping with the presentation. If you can make a full screen, Felicity, and move to the second slide. Okay, so first of all, just started with our standard acknowledgement of country. Our department recognises the First Peoples of Australia and their ongoing connection to country and culture. We acknowledge them as the traditional owners, custodians and law keepers of the world's oldest living culture and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Can we move to the next one? Felicity, next slide. Great. Okay, look, I'm going to be talking about transitioning towards net zero energy buildings in terms of commercial buildings, in terms of the sort of policies and regulatory policies in particular that we use as governments in Australia. Part of the international context for this is that we have an agreement under the Paris Agreement to achieve emissions reductions by 2030 of 43% below 2005 levels, and to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And that's, we're a federation. We have 9 governments as the Commonwealth and 8 state and territory governments. And so this is a commitment made by all the governments in Australia. One of the ways we are doing this in the policy context is through a national energy performance strategy, which is the latest iteration of our policy to try and achieve these ambitious targets in the better use of energy in particular. I should add, by way of background, Australia is a nation of 26 million people. It's highly urbanised. We've got 1 million commercial buildings and 9 million residential buildings. Those who've been to Australia would realise that we're quite high rise and is centralised in quite large cities, and so we tend to have quite large commercial buildings in the middle of cities, and that in turn means that we've got a fairly concentrated property sector, and which is very much investor exposed as well. So there's a lot of quite high level investment in property in Australia. So move to the next slide, please. Well, while we're waiting for the next slide, just to talk about a bit about that, just going to talk about the overview of the national drivers towards net zero buildings. Well, I'm really talking about building specific drivers. In this case, we're talking about, I'll talk a bit more about the trajectory for low energy buildings, which is the cooperative policy framework between the Commonwealth, states and territories, which has a range of interventions which are undertaken in a coordinated fashion. We talk about the National Construction Code, which most countries have, and also the National Australian Built Environment Rating Scheme, which is a particular energy rating scheme, which is a bit unusual. So I'll talk about it as it's seems to be effective in the way that it's being used. And the Commercial Building Disclosure Program, which is a targeted Commonwealth regulatory program, which is mandatory disclosure of energy ratings. There are many other drivers in this space. There as you know, as I've already alluded to, the particularly large buildings, commercial buildings tend to be owned by corporate entities. There's a lot of corporate targets which are involved, particularly at the top end of the market. And there's emissions obligations which are placed by government on the very largest buildings, very largest companies. And these flow down to have impacts on some of the larger buildings as well. And there's quite a number of state initiatives and grants and incentives, but I'll focus on these particular measures because they tend to be more central to what is within the purview of government. So if we move to the next slide, please. And just really wanted to touch on the trajectory for low energy buildings, just a quick whiz through what it covers. And this is between an agreement between the Commonwealth states and territories. And this is any country with a federal arrangement would know there's always a split of responsibilities between the national government and the governments in its constituent parts, and always entails an extra level of coordination and cooperation. And this is definitely true for Australia. And this looks at cooperation on both residential and commercial buildings, and also for new and existing buildings. So let's see if we can move to the 2 slides on. So I seem to be having a problem moving the slides, at least on my screen. Oh, here we are. We're up to the National Construction Code. And similar to most other countries, we have a code which applies to most new construction. And there are local variations, but not as much as in some countries. The National Construction Code is largely uniform across Australia. It's a performance-based code, which has a particular meaning for those who are involved in that. There's a dozen nations around the world that have performance-based codes. So it's not entirely a recipe list of you must have this, that, and the other. It is, if you can achieve this outcome via different means, then that's okay. So it does require, it effectively sets minimum standards that mostly focus on safety, health, amenity, and accessibility, things which are of most concern in the world of housing and buildings. But it particularly also includes a section on sustainability of buildings. And in terms of we have a 3-year cycle for updating this, and we had the first occasion where we had a national code for commercial buildings touching on energy efficiency standards was in 2006. It was updated in 2010. 2019, those changes are really only just flowing through now, and that was a really substantial improvement in terms of the energy efficiency of buildings. We saw a jump of up to 40% more energy efficient buildings as a result of those changes, which are rolling through now. And we're looking again in we just had another update in terms of residential buildings, and again, sort of we're very much looking towards the outcome. How can we make the thermal envelope and the energy used by the main services within a building, generally heating, cooling, lighting, and vertical travel, those are all covered. And that energy budget has steadily improved with each iteration. 2025 is our next one, and we're working towards a substantial change then, again on a path towards ultimately net zero buildings to the extent that we can achieve that. So let's move to the next slide. Yeah, so I should say, the construction codes are the gift that keeps on giving, because although we have 2% of our building stock is new each year, of course, over a long period of time, then that makes a really significant cumulative difference to the standards in the building stock. Now, let's talk about existing buildings, which of course, 98% of this year's buildings. And of course, they're all over the place in terms of when they were built and how efficient they are and how old their systems are and who owns them, etc. And I'll talk about the National Australian Built Environment Rating System. And that's, well, as the name implies, it's something which is peculiar to Australia. There are some codes which are rating systems which are similar around the world. It's based on actual performance. It compares like with like. And so you can see that it's got 0 to 6 stars. And that's meant to be that if one building was, if there, you take the case of office buildings, 2 office buildings next door, once you actually control for different attributes, you look at their bills, you can actually compare them. One is above average, one is below average, one will be a 4-star, one will be a 2-star. That provides a point of comparison. And certainly we found when evaluation of the impact, which I'll get to in a moment, just having that information of how is my building doing compared to another building seems to be a motivation in itself, on top of all the other, or it's foundational to allow people to manage what they measure provides a simple way of comparing. So that's been a particular one based on renewed annually based on actual energy use. It's actually converted into an emissions-based unit, so that will change over time. So let's move to the next one. So the downside of this is that you get excellent comparison like for like within building classes, but there's a lot of building classes, and so for 20 years or so we've had a really good work on in offices and shopping centres, and we've been adding in other rating tools on a voluntary basis, development for apartment buildings and data centres and public hospitals, etc., and a few new ones which we've sort of picked up the pace recently, and we're now moving into standalone retail and schools. Schools is being developed right at the moment, so we'll end up with a school star rating standard, a NABERS standard across Australia, and as well as the standalone retail, which has been developed, and the recent ones on warehouses, which are just starting to be rolled out at the moment. So these are covering the major sectors of where you've got comparable building classes. It's unlike other systems, attribute-based systems or categorization system, rating systems around the world, which can apply to almost any building. This one is peculiar because it does apply to particular sectors. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. And so one thing which was put in place 2010, so it's been around for a little while, was a mandatory disclosure program, commercial building disclosure program. It's run out of my team. It creates a building energy efficiency certificate, which takes that star rating and other attributes of the building, puts it on the public register. But more importantly, whenever office space is offered for sale or lease over 1,000 square meters, it requires this to be included on the advertising, any sort of advertising. And so it's part of the value package. It's on every ad. And so we found that that's been quite impactful. In terms of it's now upfront, it's part of the comparison, it's part of what the market is exposed to, and it's designed to, because there's a lot of office leasing rather than owning in Australia. It's been impactful in that context, overcoming split incentives and information asymmetry, but also addressing insalience in terms of the often enough the energy costs actually aren't all that important in terms of the total running cost of a business, but we have a national interest in reducing the total overall energy use. So I'll just move to the next slide. Okay, so we've done a couple of evaluations in this space. In other words, it's a trouble with government programs, is in one sense every program is an experiment. We do an evaluation, did it work? So in this case, this is from the evaluation looking at when the NABERS for offices rating tool was brought in. Years ago, there was a cohort of voluntary uptake, and you can see the line which says government leasing there. There was a requirement for Commonwealth Government to use a certain standard of NABERS rated space when they leased, and that was a very big signal to market. And there's a whole bunch of voluntary of the top end of market was captured by that. You see the energy intensity metric over to on the left on the y-axis, and then going from financial year 2006 up to financial year 2020, that was gradually improving over time. This is continual improvement. It's really interesting, the impact. This isn't just major renovation. This isn't major renovations. This is each year a small improvement through better management, upgrade of as you go type infrastructure, and generally sort of managing what you measure, as I said. Now, the impact for introducing mandatory disclosure, that cohort of buildings, which is much larger but also much smaller and older cohort of buildings, says disclosure introduced in 2011, and you can see the rate of improvement in the energy intensity of this older, smaller group of buildings, often not held by the big corporates, not leased to government. That once we had mandatory disclosure, that star rating appearing on every advertisement, there was a rapid change in the average energy intensity. So they've almost caught up with their large and green counterparts. So let's move on to the next one. Should move on. progress to date. So as you can see, the National Construction Code's been in place. We're gradually improving the standards over time. It has a cumulative impact. Should mention now the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, which includes the very large property companies and trusts in Australia have been part of that global benchmark and have consistently performed better than other participants around the world. And there's also some, as you can see, there's an extra development coming up where neighbours are moving into an embodied emissions tool, which is actually about new construction of new buildings, and to what extent is the emissions embodied in the construction materials and the construction process. How will that compare? And we're expecting that's underway at the moment, and we're expecting that to again yield a relatively simple indicator of a building which is below and above average. So let's move on to the next one. I just mentioned that some digitalisation opportunities, which is, there's a bit of work in that space. And again, that sort of general idea, like I say, you manage what you measure. It's even better if you manage what you measure, if it's better measurement in the first place and better control. So there's a lot of opportunities in this space to do things better. And we're doing some work in that. I should say that there's a couple of other areas where we're really moving. We're looking closely at electrification. It's something which is the leading companies are really looking at how to take out the gas boilers and put into and change over to electric-driven kit. And this is quite often quite expensive, retrofitting these things. So there has to be sort of it's something which we expect will take a fair while for this to work through the building sector. We're also, at the same time, in terms of emissions reduction, there's a substantial improvement in the emissions factors for the Australian electricity sector. And at the moment, the government is aiming for 83% renewables by 2030. So, hence the emphasis towards electrification, because we're reducing the emissions content of the electricity supplied. So let's move on to the last slide. Right. Okay, so thank you very much. So that's just a quick whiz over some of the main things which are happening in Australia. So hopefully it's been helpful.